Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're watching from. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth US Asia Center at the University of Western Australia, and I'm greatly honored to be involved in yet another of the wonderful Asia Undercurrent sessions. This is session 12, which I believe is the last episode of season 2 of these wonderful dialogues, and is focused on a very important topic. The future of the Indo-Pacific economic order, finding a path forward on the CPTPP. And before those of you in the audience try to say CPTPP, 5 times fast, it is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And a really important to advance in regional trade agreements. I think many of you know that in the 21st century, free trade agreements are about far more than just the business of exporting and importing. They're really about how we organize economic activity internationally. More broadly, they're about how we attach our values as a society, as people, to economic activity on things like labor, on things like human rights or environment. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership itself was part of a number of efforts to try to move the region towards a free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific, if you will, with a 21st century version of that. But I think, as many people know, in late 2016, in the US presidential campaign, free trade became highly sensitive, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership itself became a target. In the very first day of the Trump administration in early 2017, the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and many observers in the region, myself included, assumed that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was dead. But through some rather heroic efforts by Australia and by Japan in particular, and by other parties in the region, it was resurrected in the form of a comprehensive and progressive agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But here we are now, 5 years after that CPTPP came in force, 2 years after there's been a change in government in the United States. And it's a really opportune time for us to kind of reevaluate the future of the Indo-Pacific economic order, for us to look at whether or not it is possible to find a path forward for the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the form of the CPTPP. And to do that, we are really fortunate to have just a world-class panel that I am honored to moderate today. I will start with some introductions to them quite briefly. You've all seen it in the promotional materials, and then turn to them each for kind of 5 minutes of comments. First, we'll be joined by Ambassador Wendy Cutler. She's currently Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and Managing Director of their Washington, D.C. office. Wendy has 3 decades of experience as a diplomat and negotiator in the U.S. Trade Representative Office, and served as acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative before taking on her current position. Secondly, we're joined by Ambassador Jonathan Freed, who's this senior advisor with Bennett Jones LLP and the Albright Stonebridge, also a senior associate with CSIS, but similarly had a distinguished career with the Government of Canada, Ambassador of the World Trade Organization, Ambassador to Japan, and brings all that experience to our conversation today. Thirdly, we're joined by Shihoko Goto, who's Director of the Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise Program, as well as serving as Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. She has, prior to that, tremendous experience as a journalist in the region, and brings that to our conversation. And then last, but certainly not least, Ambassador Simon Tay serves as Chairman of the Singapore Institute for International Affairs, Singapore's oldest think tank, as well as Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore. Simon also had a distinguished public service career, including as a member of Parliament, chair of the National Environment Agency, and many years working on the issues that we're wrestling with today. So you can see why I'm excited for this conversation. Before I turn to our panelists, I want to remind our audience that this is an interactive enterprise. And so if you scroll down, depending on whether you're using your phone or your computer, you'll see a question and answer kind of option there for you. We'd urge you, if at all possible, to submit your questions early and often. Our colleagues will help us to kind of moderate those and put them together. I'll have a chance to kind of bring them into the conversation early. If possible, it's not required, but we would prefer that you give your name and affiliation when you ask questions. That just helps the panel know where the question's coming from, and it probably helps us think of things that we wouldn't thought of otherwise if we know if the question is coming from the Philippines or here in India. So I'm actually in India this morning, bright and early. I understand we've got well over 1,000, close to 1,500 people online right now. Tremendous groups, obviously from the Philippines, from Japan, from India, from the United States, and throughout the region. So we really look forward to sharing this discussion with you. So Wendy, without further ado, I'm going to turn to you to kick off with the initial, each of you about 5 minutes, and then we'll continue with the conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Gordon, and thanks to our viewers. And I'm really honored to be with such a distinguished panel. I have no doubt we're going to have a great conversation. I will admit going into this webinar that I was a TPP negotiator. To admit that in the United States is still not something that you really want to be out front on. I think it was President Trump who called this agreement one of the worst agreements ever. But I am a believer in the agreement, and I know that in many other trade agreements, including in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, many provisions of the CPTPP were just lifted and folded into the USMCA. So even if the United States is not part of this agreement, we're still advocates of many of the rules contained in the agreement. Recently, I published a paper with a former USTR colleague of mine, Cleet Willems, who held a very senior position in the Trump administration. And both of us advocate for the United States taking a second look at rejoining the CPTPP. We recognize that when the US exited this agreement in 2017, there was, a lot of skepticism and concern about the agreement. But we note in our paper that things have changed since 2017. First, the US, with unprecedented bipartisan support from Congress, passed the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So it shows we can do trade agreements. Second, the region has changed. There are two now. The CPTPP came into effect without the United States, with the UK on the verge of joining. The RCEP is just celebrated its first year entry into force. And there are many other bilateral agreements being completed as well as updated in the region. The United States is on the outside of these deals. And in our view, it's time for us to take a fresh look at getting inside. And finally, the United States has done a lot domestically, I would argue, to address many of the concerns of skeptics of trade and globalization through much of the major legislation that has been passed by the Biden administration. So my view is it's time for us to reconsider. And in our paper, we suggest that there are ways that the agreement can be updated, modernized, improved to address some lingering US concerns. I won't go into those areas now, and I recognize some of them will be tough for some CPTP partners. But in drafting the paper, we had extensive consultations, both internationally and domestically. And I was encouraged that I think maybe things are moving towards the direction. But I'm not naive. I don't see the United States joining in the lead up to our upcoming presidential campaign, perhaps in a second Biden administration, or perhaps once we successfully complete the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations with our 13 other partners, we'll be ready for the next steps with respect to US economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And my hope is that can include something along either the CPTPP or something along the lines of this landmark agreement. So let me stop there, Gordon.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic. And for those of you viewing this, that wonderful paper that Wendy referenced, Reimagining TPP Revisions That Can Facilitate U.S. Reentry, is on the Asia Society website. It's definitely worth looking at in greater detail. I'm going to turn next to you, Jonathan. You're one of the 2 countries in the world that have concluded a free trade agreement with the United States since in the last 6 years. And with your long career in diplomacy, obviously, you're going to bring to bear some perspectives of changes in the region, but also impact of global trends like the war in Ukraine, et cetera. So over to you, please.
Well, Gordon, thanks very much. And like Wendy, I'm very honored to be among eminent and wise colleagues. So I look forward to listening and learning as much as to talking. At your encouragement, indeed, let me take just half a step back and put our CPTPP conversation into a slightly broader context. You started by noting we're putting this in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, India is not at the table. A number of other countries aren't directly implicated in these discussions. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific more broadly, it's quite a heterogeneous region. You have LDCs, middle-income countries, and the second, third, and 10th largest economies in the world, all encompassed in the same region. And looking at various countries in the region, it's clear, of course, given all the concerns today about tensions, not only with the war in Ukraine, but East-West as well, that all countries, most all countries, acknowledge that peace is a precondition to development and growth. And there are these tensions, which are quite palpable. And tonight, we're not going to talk about this defense and security dynamic, but I think it is an important backdrop to what may unfold and what the prospects are in the near future. Second, I'd like to emphasize that, again, not to overgeneralize, but many countries in the region have domestic tensions as well, haves and have-nots, urban versus rural, favored communities versus those feeling excluded, and these domestic tensions can be very disruptive to economic prospects. So domestic governance remains an ongoing challenge because for trade to work, the domestic economy has to be reasonably well educated, well regulated. Business needs to have some certainty and predictability. Investors need to have some confidence in the medium term. And of course, as we know, infrastructure, whether connectivity or hard infrastructure or human capital investment lags behind. And that becomes an important imperative accompanying a trade agenda. And what that means is, although some countries, particularly middle income and above, are quite ready to embrace more open trade as an enhancer for economic prospects, other countries actually would put higher priority on the need for financing, for official development assistance, for investment in that infrastructure, which in effect are preconditions. Let me then take the second dimension of the near term, which is the combination of the impact of the war in Ukraine and having lived through now almost 3 years of COVID. That has triggered quite a slowdown in the inward investment I was talking about, decreased growth prospects, and unsustainable debt numbers that are growing for some of the less developed countries in the region. What does that mean? It means some of those structural reforms domestically that should be taking place are also slowed. So those political and social tensions domestically remain. So as a result, and Wendy alluded to this, when you combine the impact of the East-West tensions, the war in Ukraine, with some of these challenges of domestic governance, we are seeing ever more the advent of coalitions or clubs of like-minded countries, whether on specific sectors like high technology at one extreme, or raw materials, critical commodities at the other extreme, and in between, efforts among like-minded to address or move forward the agenda on standards, such as in the digital space, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, and Simon may have something to say on that. And that's all being overlaid on what's already a bit of a noodle bowl of various bilateral and sub-regional FTAs. So we're seeing the advent of what you might call mini-lateralism. And the risk there, when you combine the advent of economic security restrictions growing, sometimes as an excuse for protectionism, is the risk of a fragmentation of the trade and economic environment. And on the investment and sustainable development side, I think it's also fair to say that the IMF, the World Bank, the regional banks, the ADB and the AIIB are lagging in providing responsible, sustainable support for the economies of the region. So in that context, I'm not demeaning or diminishing the importance of the CPTPP, but I do think it should be seen as but one very constructive contributor to growth prospects, but alongside this broader economic agenda. Finally, just to trigger some discussion in light of Wendy's observations, the current members of TPP are first and foremost focused, number one, on implementing what they sign and on an orderly accession process, with the UK being at the front of the line. My understanding is among the members, most all are committed, quite committed to what you might call a merit-based approach to new adherents or applicants. Merit meaning open to those who can demonstrate both a willingness and a commitment to meet the high standards of the agreement. And Wendy also alluded to the reality that the United States, as will some of the other accession candidates, seek particular flexibilities or other asks. And indeed, some of them will be problematic for current members. And while there is a system that evolved in the initial negotiations of side letters and some accommodations, that becomes fairly complex, very time consuming, and in effect can slow down potential accessions and adherence. So all of which is to say, my initial message is put the TPP, CPTPP into slightly broader context. Don't forget the importance of development assistance, infrastructure investment, and domestic governance as absolute necessary accompaniments to further trade liberalization. So I'll stop there, Gordon, and pass it on.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. You've helped frame our conversation and put it in the context of broader developments extremely well. Shihoko, if we can turn to you next, you bring obviously to bear your experience as a journalist, but looking at it both from Washington, D.C. and Tokyo, a better understanding than probably most of this remarkable role that Japan has played in resurrecting the TPP in the form of the CPTPP. But obviously, since that initial time, there's been a change in leader. We very much welcome your views on the broader conversation we're having today.
Well, first of all, thank you, Gordon. It's really exciting to be here for a very timely discussion. And I really do want to thank the Nikkei for putting the spotlight on CPTPP. CPTPP, of course, is at the forefront. It's not just as an ambitious multilateral trade framework, but it is also the foundation of developing the future of an economic order in the Indo-Pacific, which is going through a great deal of change, to say the least. In focusing on Japan today, I actually want to raise 3 points. And the first one, which has already been mentioned by you, Gordon, as well as others, is that CPTPP's success to date would have not been possible without Japan's commitment to a multilateral approach to the regional economic order. Today, it's easy to take for granted that TPP would survive and even thrive without the United States. And in 2017, though, that was actually not so apparent. And there was even anxiety within Japan as it became the biggest economic power amongst the remaining 11 to actually lead without the United States. And there was concern in Tokyo about a potential pushback by the United States should Japan take this lead. And there was also great concern too that other countries would also pull out. So that has not turned out to be the case. And in fact, CPTPP is now flourishing. It has the anxiety of dealing with the accession of potential new member countries. And that success has actually become a game changer for Japan from being perceived as a rule breaker in trade to a rule maker of global trade rules and standards. And more broadly, Tokyo has actually emerged as a champion of a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, which is facing these tremendous challenges of economic coercion from authoritarian regimes in particular. And there are expectations for Japan's economic as well as political leadership. And those expectations are on the increase. And it actually goes against the trend in the United States, which is to actually pull back from multilateral trade deals. And Japan has really remained committed to staying the course and championing trade deals. In addition to leading the CPTPP, it's actually joined RCEP. It was also the first country to have a trade agreement with a post-Brexit Britain. It also encouraged the UK to join the CPTPP. And it also signed on to a bilateral trade agreement with the European Union. The second point that I would like to raise is that Japan remains supportive of US trade policy. It hasn't given up on the United States joining the CPTPP in principle. And it's really interesting here in Washington, every opportunity that Japanese officials have when they come to Washington, they really emphasize Tokyo's interest in having the United States be part of that framework. And in January of this year, which was called Japanuary because there were so many Japanese government officials, including the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, he too made a public plea to have the United States return to join the CPTPP. At the same time, Japan has actually played a key role in ensuring the success of IPEF and its 4 pillars, namely fair trade and advancing digital trade in particular, developing strategic supply chain resilience, promoting sustainability, decarbonization, and encouraging anti-corruption. These are issues that make up IPEF, and they are actually all issues that don't compete, but actually rather complement the CPTPP. And IPEF currently has 14 member countries now, and the United States is hoping that that membership will increase. And it's worth noting that Japan played a key role in IPEF too, by ensuring in particular greater commitment from Southeast Asia, most notably Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, which are actually not part of the CPTPP, but they signed on to IPEF. And countries like Brunei, Singapore, and Vietnam, which are members of the CPTPP, have also signed on to IPEF as well. It should be noted too that IPEF was launched in Tokyo. And whilst Japanese officials may privately may be lukewarm about the economic significance of IPEF, but they do remain committed to the framework. And they recognize that IPEF can play a key role in Japan's promotion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And more importantly, it is also seen as a way to keep the United States engaged on trade issues and potentially keep the door open for the United States to join the CPTPP. The third point that I want to make is the foreign policy implications of CPTPP moving forward. And they are significant, and they might actually outweigh the economic impact. There is growing concern amongst industrialized nations about, there is less concern amongst industrialized nations and especially the G7 about market access and righting trade imbalances. And here in the United States, the focus is much more about winning against China, and especially winning in a technology competition against China and being able to withstand economic coercion from authoritarian regimes, as well as from unexpected shocks and disruptions. US national security interests are increasingly driving trade policy. And meanwhile, in Japan, the broader economic goal is to be resilient to external shocks. And there is a focus on having greater domestic self-sufficiency, and for Japan to be essential to the global economy and hone in on its strengths. Those goals certainly align with that of the United States, and there is greater scope for cooperation between the two countries. CPTPP could and should be the foundation for furthering the economic partnership between Japan and the United States as the two countries face the twin challenges of strategic competition and deglobalization. Tokyo really has been prescient about focusing on Southeast Asia and calling for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Its continued rallying cry to encourage the United States to join the CPTPP may lead to results not necessarily in the near future, but potentially in the longer term. So let me leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Shihoko. Appreciate it. Simon, Shihoko's last comment was a wonderful segue to you. I mean, so much of what we've been discussing is focused on Southeast Asia. ASEAN has a very important role both at the beginning and where we currently stand in terms of looking at these issues from a regional perspective. So we're delighted to have your views from Singapore.
Thank you, Gordon. I'll try to reflect not just Singapore's views, but also those of my colleagues in ASEAN. I think I joined the panel in thanking Nikkei for organizing it. And also, I echo what you said, that the CPTPP is a very important part of the regional economic order. But I join, I think Jonathan in particular, in saying that there are other parts. That while we really welcome America to return to CPTPP, and we strongly support the initiative for IPEC, there are questions about the region having its own agenda, its own priorities and sense of agency. In the few remarks I've got, let me focus on those. First, why do we need our own sense of agency? First is that while all speakers have invoked the idea of international rule-based order, I feel that the pressure is on the system as a whole against rules. We're seeing instead a bifurcation of trade, offense by America to home shore, near shore, friend shore. The Canada, US, Mexico thing is very understandable, but the approach to the rest of the world seems quite different. This is especially when we look at the case most recently of chips, a very high value and important commodity across the region, not just in China or America or Taiwan, but affecting other countries too. On the flip side, I'm not certainly here to say that China isn't mangling some of the rules. China's own thinking about dual circulation, the Belt and Road Initiative, where all roads lead to Beijing. I think this also is a Chinese form of creating its own system, its own ecosystem. And I think this is a threat to the small countries of ASEAN, the middle-sized countries that really are seeking to find a place of growth post-pandemic. Let me turn to my second point, therefore. And this is that our response to a potentially bifurcated world is to be inclusive. You've used the term Indo-Pacific in your discussion. Both Japan and America does. Many countries in ASEAN don't, but where they do, it is the ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific, which is not values, not exclusive, but inclusive. And I think this is the kind of spirit that we're trying to bring to these other agendas, while we respect that CPTPP is strongly steered by Japan and the USA. This inclusive approach sees clearly in RCEP. We are actually quite happy that RCEP has come home as well after many years of delay. And how it moves forward, I think, will be something to watch in that old competition or tension, competitive tension between the CPTPP on one hand and RCEP on the other. My third point in the few minutes I have left is to really say that while ASEAN as a group tries to move ahead with some centrality, it will always be limited. And that's why you will see a number of countries moving forward as kind of pathfinders to find ways, especially in new areas. A number of countries are doing this. South Korea is quite active, Vietnam. But let me perhaps punch up my own country, Singapore. Though, of course, we are a very small economy. We hope to be a pathfinder, as we were back in the FTA agreements bilaterally after the failure of the Seattle round of WTO talks. We see that ASEAN-led mechanisms are moving ahead, but engaging middle powers, I think, is really the game. So Singapore has signed with the EU. In fact, I'll have to go to Brussels in about a week to further discussions on the trade and stability chapter. Similarly, Singapore has included an agreement to be with the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. In other words, while we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, the effort to reach out to different partners across parts of the world to, in a way, make up for the gaps left by the inactivity of the WTO global round, I think this is something to watch for. The Indo-Pacific has a leading place in everyone's mind, or the Asia-Pacific does have a leading place, but it is not the only intra-regional relationship. Similarly, I think that bilaterally, Singapore has been very active in a number of areas, but I'll punch up especially the digital agreements and the green economy agreements. These are relatively new undertakings and quite general, but they try in their own way to get at those deeper issues that a number of you have talked to. The CPTPP, for example, also tries to deal with labor issues, environment issues in a relatively new age way, progressive way. And similarly, bilaterally, we believe that focusing on the digital economy as well as the green economy can then be anchored back down into actually binding FTAs and move the rules-based system forward. But while we have signed with so many countries, in Europe with France, with the US for Partnership for Growth and Innovation, in our region with Australia, South Korea, and further afield with UK, we haven't actually concluded anything with Japan. So in this sense, while Goto-san gave a very good review of Japanese leadership on the CPTPP and its participation in RCEP, its strength in IPEF, I think part of the hope is that Japan will also take time to take up some of these pathfinding initiatives with other partners in Asia on a bilateral or multilateral basis. There are many things to be done in our region. I think that the post-pandemic attitude of growth is still very needful. I've just been in Malaysia, I've just been in Thailand, and you can see that the economy is still recovering. There is political change and a degree of uncertainty. We also are, in a way, a bit backward from where Europe was. We have seen just recently at the end of last year, the two largest Asian economies reopen, Japan and more recently, China. I think that there's a lot to play for in our region. The question is, how do we do this in tandem with different partners, but also amongst ourselves in a period of tension and potential conflict? Let me stop there.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your framing of the roles of individuals and countries as pathfinders. I mean, in some respects, that's exactly what Japan did together with Australia and others when the TPP seemed to be doomed in the form of the CPTPP. If I might just for a second put on my kind of Aussie hat here in this regard, I think Shihoko, you're exactly correct. The politics of the era meant that most people don't really appreciate what a tremendous accomplishment the CPTPP is. I think few in the trade community thought that with the US not in there, without the strength of the US market, that Japan would do, as you so well described, kind of rise to the leadership as the largest economy remaining. And interestingly, though, both in Canberra and in Tokyo, there was this hesitance to celebrate the CPTPP for want of kind of drawing the eye of Sauron and getting unwelcome attention. So it was kind of this very quiet, yay, TPP, but not celebrate too loudly or too much. And I think there's an awful lot to be celebrated in that regard. Look, let me remind those who are watching on the audience that if you scroll down, there's a separate app to put in your questions. I've got now the latitude to kind of continue this conversation a little bit, but we would welcome the opportunity to hear from those of you who are watching throughout the region. I want to go back because all of you have kind of touched on this, the broader environment and the broader climate, and made it quite clear that the CPTPP doesn't exist in a vacuum. You've got RCEP, which itself is quite remarkable, that every country on the screen in terms of Japan or Singapore or Canada or Australia are part of that, but not the United States. You've got this Indo-Pacific economic framework where everyone on the screen is involved in it one way or the other. I'm wondering if we might start with the Indo-Pacific economic framework to give a sense for it is seen as filling a hole in the gap of U.S. leadership because the U.S. is not in this TPP. And again, I think most of our panelists made it clear that one of the original intents of the CPTPP was to keep the door held open. Wendy, you've done a wonderful job of kind of describing how the U.S. might take some tentative steps towards re-entering that door. But in the interim, we've got this Indo-Pacific economic framework. I'd like to kind of get your candid assessments of that process and progress and how that relates with the CPTPP. We might go in the same order and just start with you again first, Wendy, if we could.
So when I think of the IPEF, I think it's an important step forward for the United States at this time to be economically engaged in the region. And frankly, I think the United States exceeded all expectations by attracting so many participants to this initiative. And I would argue that for most of them, by joining this initiative, they were endorsing stepped up US economic engagement in the region. Now, we can argue whether at the end of the day, all these countries will actually sign and join the agreement, or were they just kind of signing up, kind of curious, felt pressured, et cetera. We don't know that now, but my experience in trade negotiations, having worked in them for many years, is that once countries start negotiating, it's kind of hard then to pull back. They get very invested in the process. Now, is IPEF everything that people want in the region? No. And the absence of market access is a glaring hole. I mean, I think of, the TPP negotiations specifically with Vietnam. Like, why did Vietnam agree to such high standard labor and IPR and other rules? It wasn't because they were doing the United States a favor. It was because they were very interested in securing increased access to the US apparel and footwear market. And market access played a huge role in kind of bringing them along. And it allowed for a trade-off. In this negotiation, the administration took market access off the table immediately. From my perspective, I think that was a mistake. I think they could have just said, you know what, this isn't a traditional trade agreement. Market access isn't going to be our focus, but they could have left the door open, but they chose not to. And as a result, that's kind of put the onus on the Biden team to show and to demonstrate that IPEF does offer benefits to participants in this deal. And that's what they're working hard on now. So whether it's through capacity building, infrastructure funds, attracting more foreign direct investment to these countries, or promoting public-private partnerships, the Biden team is hard at work demonstrating the benefits of this agreement. And, we'll see over time whether that works. I would just conclude and say, in my mind too, as an experienced trade negotiator, once you do something like IPEF, you don't end there. Like, in some ways, I think, again, a successful completion to IPEF then opens the door to new possibilities. And as a result, countries aren't as scared or as nervous or as questioning about working with the United States and others on some of these key issues. Some of them are not part of trade agreements. And so, again, I think that IPEF could be a step to something more. And I couldn't agree with all the other speakers that, you know, when we look at the region, it's not just CPTPP or IPEF. You have to look at all of these initiatives. They're all kind of playing out in parallel. They all offer different things to participants in the region. But I would just conclude and say, in my mind, when I think of IPEF and I look at the other 13 countries that joined, as an American, I'm pleasantly surprised and I welcome their participation, because I think that is an endorsement of countries wanting the United States back in the region economically with a solid and robust economic agenda.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Well, I stand to be corrected, but I think what's unfolding under an IPEF umbrella is separate and parallel tracks. Some countries will opt to participate in the 4 or 5 tables. Some will say, well, I'm ready to discuss this, but not quite ready for that. So there's not necessarily a path that leads to a single IPEF agreement, but rather reforms and improvements at varying speeds. So to that extent, I agree with Shihoko's initial observation that in effect, the agenda without market access is not another trade agreement, it's a complement. By dealing with governance issues, by dealing with commonality and harmonization of standards, by dealing with corruption. And Wendy mentioned there is some effort at infrastructure, but it's a tiny portion of what is actually needed to be marshaled, even with Belt and Road, to put the region on a sustainable path. It's a complement, it's incremental, and as Gordon, you said, and Wendy said, part of the motivation for receiving the Americans warmly is to receive America back to the region. If there's one thing about ASEAN centrality and the members of ASEAN is, God forbid, anybody should force them to choose sides. They want to be inclusive and have the best of relations with their big panda neighbor to the north and their big partner across the Pacific, and enjoy the best of both without messing up partnerships. So in my view, you're going to continue to see this mixed bag, and Singapore leading the way. And I dare say Canada as well in many respects, with agreements where one or another aspect can serve as a catalyst, a pathfinder, as Simon put it, that might catalyze a broader agreement. Canada has not stood still with CPTPP. We've launched from Canada free trade negotiations with ASEAN, bilateral free trade negotiations with Indonesia, and we're already the only member of the G7 to have free trade agreements with every other member of the G7. CPTPP took inspiration from CUSMA, and vice versa, as Wendy pointed out, but into some respects, the Canada-Europe Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement had provided a gold standard that was also borrowed and brought into CPP tables as well. So those of us who see trade as a positive contributor, even risking this messy noodle bowl or spaghetti bowl, I think governments agree with Simon's take that finding like-minded initiatives, and I use the example of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, where Singapore is one of the founding members, as a fine example. Even on a sectoral or commodity-specific basis, there may be ways for like-minded to move the yardsticks. The risk is, however, as others have pointed out, that with East-West competition, with such matters as critical materials or high technology being seen as matters of national security, you still could end up with a fragmented, messy architecture. So although APEC every year continues to affirm the ultimate goal of a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, Gordon, as you said in your introduction, it's not just CPTPP plus RCEP. There are several rail lines intersecting and crossing each other in less than straight direction towards that ultimate goal. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Both you and Wendy have offered a rather hopeful take, because it is a step in a process that would hopefully continue that process. I have to confess, I was part of a panel in Indonesia late last year, and one of the questioners described the TPP as a 4 pillars, but with no walls, windows, ceiling, or floor plan. And over the last 6 months, as you described it, Jonathan, as it becomes increasingly clear that these 4 pillars are going to be separate and kind of parallel tracks, the 4 pillars themselves are not necessarily the same height or width or breadth, and so we're not quite sure where it's going. And yet, at the same time, there is clear goodwill in the region, people that want the U.S., and they're pleased to see this process moving forward. Shihoko, you've already started to address some of these issues, but I very much welcome your input to this conversation.
Yeah, so I want to make 2 points. One is the fact that US officials get terribly testy when you point out that IPEF does not have market access. And they argue that this IPEF is far more than just a trade agreement. It is an economic framework. It is ambitious and the like, and it addresses 21st century economic concerns, which may well be the case. But it is true, as has been noted a number of times already, the region is competing, it's clamoring for investments, especially infrastructure investment, and they can get it from outside of the United States. So the motivation and the incentivization to join IPEF is not necessarily as clear as it can be. And there are specific steps that the United States should really take to ensure that it continues to actually be built. Those 4 pillars are actually built on steady ground. The second point I want to point out is that there were 2 governments in particular that had wanted to join IPEF, but were not part of it. One is Canada, which recently came out with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And the other one is Taiwan. And now Taiwan, granted, had a separate deal with the United States called the US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. And the US officials would argue that because it's a bilateral agreement with Taiwan, and it doesn't have to be agreed upon with as a diverse grouping of countries ranging from Fiji to Brunei to Japan, that they can actually move forward much more quickly with this initiative than they can with IPEF. But politically, that's very small comfort for Taiwan. And therein lies this whole dilemma about the United States and its role in taking on a leadership role in the Indo-Pacific at a time when economic interests are the one issue that unite this very diverse grouping of countries. There still is a great deal of disappointment in Taiwan as the United States continues to push, rhetorical support for Taiwan, military support for Taiwan, but that is not necessarily matched by economic or trade-related support from the United States or other countries. And there is an opportunity there. But before I turn it back to you, Gordon, I do want to point out that had Taiwan been the 15th member of IPEF, that would have really not been able to move. IPEF would have not actually been able to take the shape that it did, because certainly a lot of the Southeast Asian countries would have backed out of being in an agreement with Taiwan, fearing the wrath of Beijing. And so this is going to be an ongoing issue as we talk about economic architecture in the region and trying to unite countries.
So thank you. I want to go to Simon, because obviously the countries in Southeast Asia's kind of reaction to these things is key. But before I do so, I think you've exposed an embarrassing mistake on my part. I had assumed that Canada was in IPEF. Jonathan, did I miss that? Is that incorrect? I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's one of those things where I couldn't conceptualize it any other way and I hadn't paid attention. You're on mute there, Jonathan, if I can go to you first. That's not you. There you go.
Sorry.
Thank you.
We were not invited at the initial stage. We subsequently expressed, aside from befuddlement as to why we weren't there, we expressed an interest in joining. The United States immediately welcomed that expression of interest and said they would welcome us at the table, but it was not their decision alone to take. We fully expect the other current members of IPEF to also welcome Canada to that table. The parallel, no one's really talked about this, is the Quad having not only a security table, but they're discussing economic issues such as critical materials and so on. And that's evolving into a Quad plus series of tables, depending on who's like-minded on which dimension. So Canada being an abundant source of some very important rare earths and critical materials is very much being welcomed to working tables that are Quad plus in nature. And exploring that goes back to my notion of clubs and coalitions rather than alliances of like-minded on more specific subjects. So we're half in on IPEF, I guess is the way of putting it.
Well,
and it's
not
because of any US hesitation at all.
No. Well, thank you for the clarification. Wendy, did you want to add to that before we go to Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add that at this point in the IPEF negotiations, even though the United States supports Canada joining, as Jonathan said, it's a group decision. And I think when the group had discussions, their conclusion was they needed to come up with kind of procedures for any additional participants, not just for Canada. And so it's become like a broader discussion.
Well, if nothing else, this webinar has given us a chance to appreciate not just only the launch of Canada's rather forward-leaning Indo-Pacific strategy, but their importance of USMCA, in TPP or CPTPP, and now hopefully in RCEP as well. Simon, you've been very patient. Much of the conversation right now has centered on ASEAN's response and potential response to different framings of this. I'd welcome your kind of views of IPEF and ASEAN.
Well, thank you. I first want to say that maybe Singapore, my country, is a bit different. We jump into almost anything that seems as though it's economically useful. So we are the only ASEAN country with a bilateral FTA with America, and we are a country with a FTA with Taiwan. So yet we have a FTA and very close working ties with mainland China. So this is why I mean we are example not only a pathfinder, but trying to be that inclusive hub. Maybe so far so good, but the tensions are growing. I would say that for the rest of ASEAN, the CPTPP has been a fraught question. As you know, only 4 members are in, and Malaysia has not quite ratified, though we expect that this parliament and Anwar Ibrahim will get it done.
I think they ratified in November.
Yeah,
is that correct?
Can I just clarify something?
Vietnam.
Malaysia has ratified now, and Canada's not a member of RCEP. So
exactly. I think earlier when you said all of us are members of RCEP, I was a bit confused too. My mistake then about Malaysia, they managed to get it done in the interregnum while
it was recently.
Yeah, because earlier on, I think Goto-san mentioned that there were 3 members in CPTPP. There are actually 4. But my big point is that really 4 out of 10 isn't dramatic. We had actually hoped that with Japan's leadership, the queue would be quite an orderly one, which would see Thailand, which had expressed some mixed interest, some hesitation, but competitive instinct vis-a-vis Vietnam and the Japanese supply chains. Thailand and perhaps Indonesia or the Philippines sign up. But as it is, the queue right now is, as you know, the UK, mainland, and then Taiwan, ROC. So really, there are big question marks about how the CPT will be shift to be more inclusive of ASEAN. And that's why I meant that ASEAN really has to find its own path. It has to start with the RCEP. It has to also reinvigorate the ASEAN Economic Community, which is coming up to review in 2025. Now, if I may make a comment, therefore, about American leadership, I want to say that whether it's IPEF, CPTPP, America's presence is much wanted in that inclusive way. But the demands of being exclusive, of America deciding roughly who is in or out, that's painful. And this is especially when there is a sort of change every now and then in the American democracy, and not so much the character of the president, but the policy decisions that arise. We mustn't forget that TPP was abandoned after years of work that Wendy and others have put in. On the first day of the Trump administration, we are going to face another presidential election. And while I'm hoping that IPEF can make an achievement before then, I'm hoping that what Wendy said of queuing up, preparing for perhaps a return to an amended TPP might come through. I must say that my concern is that, again, we'll face a domestic change that will affect very gravely its relationship and presence in our region.
Look, I'm getting a long stream of questions that are coming in from the audience, so I want to make sure I reserve time to turn to that. But we've talked about, and clearly I've made some initial mistakes in terms of Canada's role at different organizations. But this question of accession is really important, both for the CPTPP and for RCEP. I'm sitting this morning in India. One of the things that makes the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework interesting is that India is in it, where they're not in RCEP, they withdrew, they're not in the CPTPP. And so that in itself makes it quite interesting. And yet India just decided not to participate in the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We've talked about potential accession to the CPTPP and to Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and questions about Canada, questions about Thailand. You could probably add the Republic of Korea to that as well. So I want to start with you, Wendy, and just say where to from here. And I know I'm conflating two different organizations here, but if you're looking at CPTPP, there is the current question of the United Kingdom. There are hopes for others: Korea, Thailand, Indonesia. There are the politically sensitive questions of China, Taiwan. That next steps in terms of progress. And then if I might get you just to say a word about India as well.
So a lot of questions there. Let me just make one point that this gets to India too, is that the United States is shown and has been a proponent of flexibility in IPEF. And I would think all the countries would welcome that in IPEF because that kind of gives them more, they can decide on their own what to join and what not to join. So I'm a little surprised that some of the panelists have been kind of critical of the United States showing this flexibility, when if we didn't show flexibility, then people would be criticizing us for saying everyone had to join everything. So I think by showing flexibility, that shows that the United States has listened to countries in the region and recognized that they're not all ready to do and prepared to do all four pillars, with India as example. It's not ready and does not want to join the trade pillar. So should that prevent it from working with us on supply chains or decarbonization or anti-corruption? Of course not. And could India over time join the trade pillar? Sure. So I think the flexibility is a good thing. Just from another technical point of view, I would add that while we're focused on Asia, there are three other formal applicants that have expressed interest in joining the CPTPP in the other part of the world, and those include Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Ecuador. So they're also in the queue for accession to the CPTPP. So here's my take on accession. And, the United States is not a member. So, maybe you should be asking someone else first. But I would, of course, offer my views here. Number one, I think the UK accession, everyone thought this could be done by the end of the year, that this would be easy. The UK had, bilaterals with a lot of the CPTPP members, was a like-minded country. And it's been a difficult accession negotiation. And that's because this is a really detailed agreement, not only with rules, but also with market access commitments that include, a lot of kind of complex arrangements between the existing TPP members. There had been hope that the CPTP members, as early as last week, could announce an agreement in principle with the UK. That apparently was not possible. So those negotiations continue, but my sense is they'll probably wrap up successfully. And then the spotlight's really going to turn to the applications by China and by Taiwan. And that's going to be really difficult. We've already seen some differences in views among CPTP members about how these applications should be considered. I think my view at this point is that unlike the WTO accession 22 years ago now, China will never agree to the establishment of a working group for Taiwan. And as a result, certain CPTPP members who kind of want to support China joining may find themselves in a difficult position because the agreement explicitly mentions that customs territories can accede to the agreement. And so I think what we're going to see, regrettably, will be kind of a paralysis with respect to accession candidates coming after the successful conclusion of the UK. I could be wrong, but that's kind of my take right now. And in my view, I'll just conclude, and I've been public on this, I don't think China's game is like they're looking towards the end of this negotiation and successfully getting into the CPTPP. I think it's all about starting the process, getting their nose under the tent, and almost becoming a de facto member of CPTPP so they can influence the CPTPP going forward. So for example, if the CPTPP members decide that they need to modernize the agreement in the areas of digital or green, and they're in accession negotiations with China, China's views are going to be taken very seriously there. And so I think for China, again, less about the end game, more about the upfront kind of involvement.
Thank you. Simon, let me go to you because obviously, along with Australia, Singapore was there at the very first iteration of the TPP. You described it as a country that kind of likes to jump in and join any organization. I think Australia probably shares that characteristic with you. But as is quite clear, there's some sensitive issues here. We have a question from the audience. A civil servant from India is asking how members of the CPTPP can balance their economic security, especially in the light of several controversial nations wanting to join. And so looking at that from a Southeast Asian perspective, you've already talked about your own questions in terms of accession. How do you balance economic security with what Wendy has just said in the process of next steps for the CPTPP?
Well, I think if the questioner is really signaling about China's economic weight and potential coercion, I think this is something that really we have to deal with quite apart from the CPTPP. I mean, China is not in the first place inside, so I'm not sure that if the questioner is jumping ahead of the realities on the ground. So I think as it is, the CPTPP is worth pursuing, worth really championing. It is a high standard agreement. We have put a lot of years into it. The question of China economic domination, or coercion, which was said earlier, I think really has to be passed much more carefully. There are a number of Belt and Road and other signs where China is bullying. For example, when it preyed on, it's prevented Australian lobsters and wine to their detriment, I would say, for entering their market. So the rest of us had Australian wine cheaper. But there are ways in which countries in our region, not just Singapore, but many countries, are finding that sense of agency working with China. I know this may not be politically correct in the discussion panel with America and Japan, but I think many of us are still finding there is a partnership in China that is worth pursuing with eyes open, not with, in love with China for China's sake, but on a very rational basis. Things can be done to help the rebound of our economies. And maybe if I just allowed maybe 1 minute for my closing and leave the rest to say theirs, I think that's key. We really are in a position where post-pandemic, we are looking for investment, trade, sense of resilience and security from different sources. And so we can't expect that a bifurcated world with fewer choices, that's better for any of us. That is why, rather than indecision, this is the decision of most everyone in Asia. We welcome America. We want to do IPEF if possible. We, of course, would love market access. I'm glad to hear Wendy point out this gaping hole, I think was her words. But we are interested in America returning to the region in some form. This TPP would make some sense. But we will not, I think, be waiting only for America. We must get on with our own prospects for growth.
Thank you. That's a great segue to a question we got from the Philippines. And Jonathan, I might steer this towards you. They asked, what is the CPTPP's potential economic and social contribution to developing countries, such as the Philippines, Brunei, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka? You started out your remarks kind of framing this in a broader context of development. I was wondering if you might specifically answer that question.
Sure. Let me, however, preface with a quick remark about economic security, just to clarify what I was also trying to say earlier. Look, trade and investment between the United States and China and the Western China have actually gone up despite the tensions, but in, shall we say, garden variety, run-of-the-mill trade in items or commodities or technology that doesn't pose what is considered to be potentially a national security threat. So what is happening is, even within a free trade context, the national security exception, in effect, self-interpreted in the US view, is being broadened. Whether you view it as protectionist or legitimate, there are certain segments of an overall economic relationship that are being carved out, and thus we have some fragmentation. Add on the other side the notion of the return of industrial policy, the massive subsidization that we're now witnessing in the name of competition, in the name of competing not just by throwing sticks at your competitor, but by offering your own producers carrots to better compete. And that too creates distortions where there doesn't appear to be willingness, either regionally or multilaterally, to develop any rules of the game that would constitute a ceasefire or some ratcheting down of this growing subsidies competition. So let me turn to the development side. The CPTPP and the negotiators of the original agreement, in common to some extent with the WTO rules, does have allowance and some specific provisions for specific countries to grow into the high level of standards and obligations. And if, as a result of those discussions, one or another country says, look, we're not ready, we need time to adjust, they, in many examples, have been given the opportunity and that time to do that. What I tried to say earlier is growing into a trade framework, if accompanied by the kind of advice, assistance that the more developed countries are actually offering. Here's how to run a modern customs service. Here's how to run science-based inspections of food and agricultural products, and so on. This contributes to a better run domestic economy that's better able to embrace inward competition and have their exporters be ready to meet the standards of the importing country that are commonly based on international benchmarks. So I think the CPP architecture actually is quite supportive of a sustainable development path. It doesn't quite go as far as many EU agreements with developing countries that integrate into the agreement firm commitments on official development assistance directed at helping countries have the capacity to do that. We've done that in a WTO context with the Trade Facilitation Agreement, but not quite in the CPTPP context.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time, and I want to come back to a lightning round at the very end. But Shihoko, I want to direct a question to you from a graduate student at Kyushu University. And we've kind of danced around it in our conversation today. They ask, with the competing trade framework in place in the Indo-Pacific region, do you think that the geopolitical objective is becoming important for economic frameworks like the CPTPP? With the other trade agendas like RCEP in the region, are countries required to pick sides? So if I might get you to address that, and then we'll come back to a last round.
Yeah, I think it strikes at the heart of the matter. So the United States and Japan, for instance, used to be economic rivals, right? Trade was the biggest source of friction between the two countries. Now we are reaching a point where it is economic issues and trade concerns in particular that really do unite these two countries. And what we are seeing is that the concern about continued economic growth is there, yes. But at the same time, there are greater concerns about national security and defense strategies that require coordinated efforts by like-minded countries. And so how does that fit into the CPTPP or a broader economic framework? I think that's one of the issues that is moving forward. But if we focus too much on that, I think we're losing sight of what trade agreements are really trying to pursue. The three other panelists are much more, they are professional negotiators, but what I can say is trade agreements should enhance efficiency. It should facilitate trade. These are goals that really do need to continue to be pursued. We haven't really talked about cost effectiveness. One of the challenges that we're going to see as the United States continues to be withdrawn from trade agreements, as we start to see countries taking on more protectionist measures, as we see countries taking on greater industrial policy and becoming inwardly focused, it actually raises prices. And so when we talk about economic security, the traditional way of defining economic security is about continued growth, right? It's not about the national security implication. It really is about, can a country actually continue to grow and expand further? I hope that we can actually get back to first principles on this as we try to move forward on CPTPP and RCEP. I think one of the beauties of CPTPP is that it has brought together so many disparate countries. It has brought together communist Vietnam with the Sultanate of Brunei, with a country like Japan. And now Korea and Japan have a very testy relation, but this provides a platform for the two countries to work together in the future. This is an opportunity to work together towards that common goal. And I hope that this framework will actually continue to.
Well, thank you. There's a long list of questions we're not going to be able to get to. A student from Malaysia wanted to know about the interplay between the BRA and the CPTPP. We've talked a little bit about that. Questions about the upcoming G7 summit and what it might do. But I want to just take, just very briefly, 2 or 3 sentences, if I might, a final last round from our panelists, and ask the question about what are you looking for the rest of this year? All right, so we're already in March of 2023. When it comes to CPTPP or kind of movement in this front in 2023, Our audience has already been well informed by this discussion. What are you watching? What are your concerns? What are the key dates? What are the key decisions that you think are going to be important in this trend for the rest of the year that our audience should pay attention to? And we'll go in reverse order. We'll start with you, Simon.
Thank you very much. I'm not looking particularly at the CPTPP because of what Wendy said. There are various existing agenda of emissions and plans, which roughly are quite predictable. I think where I'm trying to look my energies and analysis is about the pathfinding, not just by my country, but by others, trying to find paths forward for growth in the digital economy, sustainability and green economy. And these are really cross-cutting issues, which really will have potential to deal with problems like climate, but also grow the economy. At the same time, these are also subject to a lot of the industrial policies that are emerging out of America and Europe, and things like the carbon border adjustment measures. So there's a lot to play for in talk of the interactions between trade and economic investment with these newer issues of environment, digitalization, etc.
Thank you.
That's for me.
Thank you. And I know you have to sign off, but very quickly, Shihoko, Jonathan, and then Wendy, what are you looking for in 1 or 2 sentences?
Yeah, so deglobalization and protectionism are the watchwords for this year, I think. And the United States is hosting APEC, Japan is hosting the G7. Concrete steps to deal with this, if they can be done from a trade perspective, I think that would be something that would be a step in the right direction from the 2 sides.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Just to unmute, look, I think the year will be tense. First, there's still fragility in inflation prospects and in growth prospects overall. So the macro environment puts some pressure on people and therefore some restrictions on appetite to liberalize in that context. I think indeed, as Shihoko highlighted, the tension between this economic security debate, binational tendencies and continued trade restrictions, whether East-West or Trans-Pacific, more generally, will continue to plague us. So indeed, APEC and G7 have a role to play, as does India's G20 hosting, in at least putting a cap on things getting worse. We need to stabilize the environment and look forward to a more constructive discussion. Remember, you have the next WTO ministerial meeting in early 2024 to look forward to as well. That will determine prospects overall.
Thank you. Wendy, the final word is yours.
Okay, so 2023, you can invite me in early 2024 to see if any of this really happens.
Yes,
successful UK accession to the CPTPP, successful APEC host year by the United States, dealing with deliverables on climate, food security, trade facilitation, and gender. IPEF, major achievements in the 3 pillars led by the Commerce Department, with the trade pillar talks continuing. G7, G20, I think we mentioned with India and Japan hosting, I think there'll be deliverables in the G7, particularly on digital, and the G20, I think there's major movement they can make on some of these public good issues as well. And finally, with respect to China, I see US-China tensions continuing, including in the economic area, but hopefully we'll see some guardrails and a floor and continued efforts to try and stabilize the relationship by the 2 leaders.
Fantastic. Look, my hope for next year is that we see a season 3 of this magnificent Asia Undercurrent series. You can help with that. I'll put a plug in there as a frequent participant. If you scroll down, there's an evaluation link for all of you who are watching this. We'd welcome you to fill that out and appreciate that very much. On behalf of myself and the panelists, our particular thanks to the government of Japan and to Nikkei for putting on this series, and particularly this episode number 12 of the 2nd season. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of you from throughout the region who have signed on to join us for this conversation. And we look forward to seeing where this goes next. Thank you. Appreciate it.